Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ute Dash, the Utah football show on Dash Sports. I'm Cole Bagley, the host for today's show, and I'm joined by my co-host Sammy Mora. Sammy, how are we doing?
I'm good, just churning out some stories, just sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for the Pac-12's announcement tomorrow. How are you, Cole?
Just eagerly awaiting that announcement. I need football in my life. They need to give it to me.
I completely agree. It's been too long since we've seen Utah football on the field.
Yeah, it's. I was near the stadium the other day on campus, and just looking in sadness, looking on in sadness of what could have been this season. But we may have Utah football, and like we said, we will find out tomorrow. And if there is Utah football, Sammy, the first thing we want to talk about today is should the Pac-12 be eligible to make the playoffs if the season happens? What do you got?
I say no. They're playing if the proposed plan that we've been hearing is true, they're going to be playing less games than the SEC and the Big 12 and the ACC. You got to draw the line somewhere. And as much as I would love to see a Utah or an Oregon or an ASU or a USC in the playoffs, I don't think they do it. I don't think that they should be allowed in the playoffs because they're not reaching that threshold. And I get that this has been a season that's all over the place. There's games being canceled. There's conferences that aren't playing. There's schedules that are changing at the last minute. But at the same time, you have to draw the line somewhere. And I don't think that the Pac-12 should be eligible.
One thing to consider, though, is, the playoffs is all about the best teams. They take those top four, and by whatever system they choose to use, those should be technically the best four teams in the entire nation. And so if the Pac-12 can produce a top four team, whether it's Oregon or Washington, Utah, whoever it may be, they should be allowed to be in the playoffs, because technically that's why the playoffs was created, right? Is to try and give the opportunity of the top four to prove themselves as the best. Because before, when you had the BCS, there's a lot of hearsay about, oh, well, this team, should have been the national champions. Oh, it could have been these guys. To me, yeah, they might have a shorter season, but that doesn't mean that they're not worthy of being in that top four and competing for a national championship.
But here's the other thing. When you're talking about the best of the best, would you rather have an undefeated Oregon team who played 7 games, not even a full conference schedule if we were playing a full season? Would you rather have an undefeated Oregon team or a one-loss Ohio State who's also playing a shortened season? Or would you rather have a one-loss Florida in that playoffs because the Florida team has played 10 games? I just don't think it's fair. You can't compare a team that's played 10 games to a team that's only playing 8 or 7. It's not fair, because these other teams are putting in this work and they're playing these extra games and they're putting their bodies through all this work and risking injury and stuff like that. But then a team who plays less games would be able to sneak into that playoff. It just doesn't add up.
A big part of it could come down to the strength of schedule. A lot of teams are being forced to just compete within their conferences. And so with the Pac-12 being a Power 5, I think that right there is a strong argument for why, hey, if they're 7-0, if you've got a 7-0 Pac-12 team that's looking pretty good, maybe they do belong in that playoff, opposed to a Big Ten or SEC team that's got 1 or 2 losses. You make a good point. It would be tough to say, okay, this team only played 7 games. They should make it over a team that played 10, only lost once. But they are a Power 5. It's a great conference. And if a Pac-12 team is going to come out of the conference undefeated, it would be really hard to say no to them being maybe that 4th spot. I mean, I would be surprised if you're seeing them at the 1 or the 2, but I think it's worthy, even if it's a shortened season, putting them in that college playoff at that 4th spot if they're undefeated.
It just doesn't make sense for them to include them in there. But also you got to look at schedules, how these conferences are building these schedules. People are saying that Nebraska got a very hard schedule when the Big Ten released it. Ohio State has one of the easier schedules. Is the Pac-12 going to do the same thing to kind of set up an Oregon or a USC or an ASU or even a Utah to make a run? Because when you're not playing a full conference schedule like we would in a regular season, you can kind of pick and choose who you want to play. Then why wouldn't you rather play a weaker team in the conference than a stronger team? Because if I had to choose Utah's schedule, I would be avoiding those teams that would risk making us lose a game, like risk an Oregon or a USC or an Arizona State or a Washington. I would want to take the easy route to make that undefeated stretch. And yeah, it does come down to strength of schedule, but how much is that actually going to play into effect when this all comes down?
Well, that's one of the bigger questions that a lot of people are asking and need to continue to ask. I mean, there's been some crazy talk, and we know how crazy BYU fans get, here in Utah. But people saying, hey, if BYU is undefeated at the end of their season, and they play 9 or 10 games, should they be permitted into the playoff? Obviously they're an independent. The strength of their schedule isn't great, but would an undefeated BYU or maybe a 8-1, 9-1 BYU team be more worthy of a playoff spot than an undefeated Pac-12 team? And I say no to that, obviously. But looking at other sorts of teams like Notre Dame, an independent, if they're undefeated at the end, if Notre Dame only has one loss at the end of the season, should they be allowed into the playoff over an undefeated Pac-12 team? And my answer to that would be no.
Notre Dame's associated with the ACC this year. All of their games they're playing are ACC teams. They were granted that 1 year to be in the conference. So you get that's an exclusion this year, because usually you could make that argument about Notre Dame, but since they're not playing an undefeated schedule like BYU is this year, I could see a Notre Dame making it into the playoff this year just because they're playing that ACC schedule.
Yeah, and it's very true, and it's difficult, and it's honestly, Sammy, a part that I want to kind of shed some light on is maybe it could be a punishment for the Pac-12 for starting their season so much later and not making the playoff. I mean, to me, what it kind of seems like is the Pac-12 decided at the last second to start discussing things because they didn't want to be the last team, the last conference, the last Power 5 conference to not be playing football this fall. And so do you think it could potentially be a slap on the wrist a little bit and saying, hey, the rest of us are ready to play football. You were the last ones to come in and decide. We're not going to let you in.
The Pac-12 has always been the team looking from the inside, looking from the outside in the college football playoff. It's always been that way. The Pac-12 hasn't had a team in a while make that jump into the playoffs. So you can't really argue that it's like a slap on the wrist for them playing late, because if it was, the Big Ten would be in the same position. But people are still predicting Ohio State to go to the playoffs, and they're starting around the same time the Pac-12 is rumored to be starting. So you can't say that it's just going to be like a slap on the wrist for the Pac-12, because then it should be also a slap in the wrist for the Big Ten, because they waited until the last minute to also play.
Yeah, it's partially the unfair lens that the college football NCAA seems to have towards the Pac-12 a little bit. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. And for any of our viewers watching, pay attention tomorrow. There should be a press release, a news release on what the Pac-12 decides to do. I'm hoping it's more of a lengthy schedule. I'm hoping they're pushing for 8 to 9 games. Maybe we'll get lucky at 10, but I could see a six-game schedule as they'll be starting so late.
With time, there's no way for the Pac-12 to do 10 games between now and championship weekend if they want a team to be in the playoffs. Just looking at a calendar, there's no way. 7 or 8 is the most logical and the most reasonable number of games that we can have right now, given how late the Pac-12 was like, yeah, let's play. Like 8, it's like less than 9 is what I'm shooting for.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sammy. And like I said, we'll find out tomorrow. So everybody be paying attention to that.